Hello, 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 and welcome back to this week's edition of Anchor Watch, where we have a very, very special guest for you. Someone who is a subject matter expert in many things. And what we talk about on this show is getting subject matter expertise to break down some of the more complex issues that we're seeing both domestically and abroad. We have with us Professor Barbara McQuade, former U.S. Attorney General, current professor at University of Michigan, who is uniquely qualified to talk about a variety of issues. I mean, she has prosecuted some very high profile cases in her past, but at the same time, she is a New York Times bestselling author with her latest book, Attack from Within: How Disinformation is sabotaging American democracy and the rule of law. It's a long title, but it's important because there's many aspects to it. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you, Barbara, for joining us today.
Oh, thanks very much, Bobby. I'm glad to be with you.
So to get started, can you give people just a little bit of an overview of your background? It's like I said, it's highly unique. It's very University of Michigan centric. That was a school I wanted to go to when I was younger, but then I saw it snowed a lot up there, so that changed. um, but specifically, though, what led you into law and then the public service element? You had a lot of options to do a lot of more lucrative things, and then you find yourself prosecuting high profile cases. Can you just give us a little bit about your background and motivation, please?
Yeah, sure. As a child, I think there are probably two things that motivated me in life. One is I wanted nothing more than to be the shortstop for the Detroit Tigers. Um, and if I couldn't do that, I wanted to be president of the United States. And I was told as a girl in the 1960s that neither of those options were open to girls. And I was deeply offended. And it really violated my sense of justice and equality. And I think it was something that drove me to want to address those issues in society. We tell our children they can be anything they want to be, and then when push comes to shove, truth is they can't. So whether it's racial barriers, gender barriers, religious barriers, I've always found them disgusting and distasteful. I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to do everything I could to knock them down. The other thing that was very influential for me is in part just because my first kind of memory of political events was Watergate. And I remember watching those hearings as a child and being very offended that the president had done something awful that was wrong. I didn't really understand all of it, but I knew that he had betrayed his trust. And so I was very impressed by the reporters and the lawyers who were able to take him down. And I thought, ordinary people were able to expose this misconduct by the most powerful man in the world. And that I think all of that led me to a path in the law. And I worked in private practice for a while out of law school, but really where I felt my calling as a lawyer was as a federal prosecutor, job I had for about 20 years. And it really brought together those ideas of using the law to right wrongs, using the law to prevent discrimination and to promote equality, and using the law to hold powerful people accountable when they betray their trust.
Mhm. No, and it is funny that you mentioned that your first recollections was watching Watergate and how you had an actual, hearing process that led to an impeachment process and a Congress that was willing to do
Yep.
it in such overwhelming evidence. Um, when you look at the political landscape now, right? And I know people are like, oh yeah, this guy's guilty, he's this, that, and other. Let's just pause for a second. When you look at just the legal landscape as a former federal prosecutor, right? Who's being prosecuted, who's not, who's being pardoned, who's not. What concerns you the most of regarding our current state of the legal process in America, based on what you're saying?
Yeah, there's so much that's upside down, Bobby, but the Justice Department really concerns me.
Mm,
We've seen this executive order from the president and then memos from the Attorney General Pam Bondi accusing their predecessors of weaponizing the Justice Department,
mhm,
something I saw absolutely no evidence of. The fact that they charged Donald Trump with election interference seemed like a well grounded indictment to me. The fact that they charged him with unlawfully retaining government classified documents seemed like a well grounded indictment to me. And the fact that they criminally prosecuted, what was it, 1,900
yes.
people who attacked police officers at the Capitol in an effort to stop the certification of a presidential election, all of that conduct seemed perfectly valid to me. And so when President Trump comes into office and calls that weaponization, what I see is his using that as a way to turn the tables on his opponents and say now all he is doing is holding accountable the people who weaponized the Justice Department against him in the past. And then naming people like John Bolton and James Comey, the FBI director, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, accusing all of these people of committing crimes. It's painful to see because that is not the way the Justice Department is supposed to work. When I was there, it worked apolitically. A new president might come in and have new priorities. President Obama cared about civil rights and cybercrime. President Trump in his first term cared about immigration enforcement. That's all fair game. But this idea of I'm going to use the tools of the Justice Department to go after my political opponents is not something we have seen before in America. And it is something that I find deeply disturbing.
Well, I'm glad you zeroed in on that, because can you explain to our viewers who may not know the level of independence the Department of Justice is supposed to have separate from the commander in chief, and why that it's supposed to be the case?
Yeah, this is a really important distinction. So, under our constitutional form of government, the president is the executive, and so he oversees all of the executive branch agencies, the cabinet agencies, and that includes the Department of Justice. But starting in the Watergate era, when we had all of these abuses get exposed, not only President Nixon's use of, telling the CIA to tell the FBI to stand down and not investigate the break-in at the Watergate, that was, and the cover-up that went with it, that was one of his most egregious examples of misconduct. But one of the things that became revealed at that time through a series of hearings before the Senate with something called the Church Commission was that the FBI had abused a lot of its authority to spy on people the president considered subversive and political enemies. So that included Vietnam War protesters. It included civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King. They had the program they called COINTELPRO, which was counterintelligence program. And they did a lot of things that were very politically motivated and not on the up and up. And so in response to Watergate, a number of reforms were passed. Many of them are just norms and not laws, but among them, and among the most important, are two that were in place when I served as a prosecutor. One is something called the Principles of Federal Prosecution, and they are the policy manual for federal prosecutors, kind of the do's and don'ts. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. And one of the most important rules in that policy manual is that partisan politics must never play a role in a charging decision. You can't say, well, this guy's a Republican, so we're going to go after him for, fraud, or this guy's a Democrat, so we're going to go after him for corruption. It has to be based on fact and law. And that's been true since that Watergate era. The people I worked with in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we weren't bipartisan. We were nonpartisan, right? We were just trying to look at facts and law. One of the most prominent cases I prosecuted was against our former Democratic mayor. Even though I was appointed by a Democratic president, I didn't care. We had evidence, we had facts, and we brought the case. So that was one of the most important reforms from that Watergate era. There was one more, and that was a ban on communications between the White House and the Justice Department. So only at the highest levels, the Attorney General could speak to the White House counsel if there was a need to coordinate. Hey, just so as you know, we're going to indict, this regime out of Iran that could cause diplomatic fallout. You might want to know that because we want to make a decision that's in the best interest of the government. That sort of thing is fair game. But what's not supposed to happen is the White House to pick up the phone and make a phone call to a prosecutor's office in Detroit or Virginia or Ohio and say, hey, that case you've got against that protester, or that case you've got against that investor or that congressman, yeah, I want you to go easy on him. Right? Remember, he had President Trump told Jim Comey to go easy on Mike Flynn. And
Yes. Yeah.
now is a real erosion in those norms that I worry is going to have long-lasting harm to the Department of Justice.
But Barbara, you raise a very valid point. You kind of slipped it in, but I just want our viewers to understand the difference of doing your job and then being influenced. You were part of the prosecution of Kwame Kilpatrick, right? The former mayor of Detroit, who, by the way, was the scion of a political family. So there was a lot of pressure. That was a national story. and y'all presented the evidence, and it was adjudicated properly.
Yep.
You mentioned norms. That is the norm. Everybody under the law, same execution. The constraints versus restraints of federal prosecution. What I mean by that is you mentioned the norms
hmm
of how you're supposed to do business, and then legally what you can and cannot do. So, constraints, restraints. What I think a lot of people are confused about is they hear that, for example, the National Guard can be in DC, it's legal, but it's unnerving, and people are like, why are they not pushing back? Blah, blah, blah. This is one of those things where I say that's constraint versus restraints. That's how, as a military guy, I lay it out. Can you talk about this in particular, the occupation of
Yeah.
DC, Trump saying that he wants to put, the same type of thing in other cities, not a coincidence, they're blue states or blue cities, but the unprecedentedness, I guess, if that's a word, of such an action when we have 200 some odd plus years of history saying, hey, military is not law enforcement, and there's a reason why.
Yeah. So there are laws that have some restrictions on the president's ability to use federal agents and federal troops to enforce the law. So, one challenge, of course, is that Congress gives the president power to use emergency powers in a time of emergency. We want somebody to be able to respond nimbly if we are attacked, if is some sort of civil unrest or rebellion, or somebody tries to storm the Capitol or storm the White House. And so there is a statute that says the president may, in times of emergency, federalize the police department when there's a national emergency, and may call up the National Guard. What's interesting about that, though, Bobby, is what it really seems to contemplate is that the emergency be a federal emergency. Like, I need all hands on deck here because people are storming the White House, or I need
Right.
all hands on deck here because people are storming the Capitol. And I'm sorry, police. I know ordinarily you enforce traffic laws and street crime, but for this moment, for up to 30 days, I need all hands on deck to address a federal problem. What he's done is actually the opposite of that. What he has said is, I think the ordinary crime in Washington is intolerable. And, I'm not going to, sugarcoat and say there's no crime in DC, although we are at a 30-year low, but certainly it could be improved. But instead, what he's doing is he is doing the opposite of what that statute allows, and having federal law enforcement enforce state laws by having them doing patrols and checkpoints, and mostly, I think, a show of force. So it has a feel to me, in my opinion, that what he's really doing is demonstrating force and normalizing the use of military force in cities to be able to do what he wants to do, so that when he needs it, if he needs to suppress protest, he has the ability to do that. And I base that opinion, Bobby, on the fact that in Detroit, when I was serving as U.S. attorney, we worked cooperatively with the city of Detroit to try to address violent crime, and we had some success. But we did it not by taking over. We did it by supplementing and letting the Detroit Police Department take the lead and offering assets to supplement their needs. So, for example, police officers are the best at patrolling their streets. They know their streets the best. They know their neighborhoods. If they're doing their job well, they're the cop on the beat, and they even know, like, the neighbors, and they know this gang operates out of this area, and this guy has this little store, and we've got, all these people in the neighborhood. They're the best people to be in the local community. But what federal assets can come in and do is provide intelligence assessments, right? We've got gang intelligence that tells us that this gang is mad at that gang and we're expecting a hit. And so we can surge resources to try to reduce that. Or we might be able to say gun crime is very high in this particular area. So we're going to bring in the resources of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, because they're really good at tracing bullets that come out of guns, and they can identify a crime gun and perhaps identify a user who used that gun and find what's called a trigger puller. And so by supplementing local assets cooperatively, leaving the police chief of that community as the command leader is the best way to do that. The other thing that is useful is having community organizations work in a prevention strategy. And the way you do that is providing grant funds to community organizations to help people. Because you know what drives crime, of course, is poverty. And so
Hmm.
if people have access to education and job training and other resources, substance abuse, those kinds of resources can also help reduce crime. But you know what Donald Trump did in April is he made drastic cuts to the grants that the Department of
Yep.
Justice administers to these
Yep.
kinds of community groups. So it says to me that he's not really serious about reducing crime in these cities. He is interested in scoring political points by showing force.
Hmm.
Look, America, I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm being tough on crime. I think he might suppress crime for a short period of time, but I think in
Hmm.
the long term, it's not going to make a dent the way the other programs have been working and reducing violent crime in cities around America.
You bring up a couple of excellent points. The grant money that you mentioned was cut in April. I mean, look no further than 30 miles up the street in Baltimore, where they have had significant progress using these other issues, other tactics to bring down the crime rate. Their mayor flat out said, "Hey, President Trump, we're willing to share what we have been doing. By the way, you're cutting our funding for something that's been effective." I also, my military background, I know for a fact that we are not trained to
Yeah.
be peacekeepers. I was a peacekeeper, but I had to go to special training to do that in Africa, not here, not in the United States. And so, to show you how much of a problem it's already becoming, as of today, Hegseth was ordered by Trump to basically train a certain population of the National Guard in basically local law enforcement, because he still, like you said, he wants that visual of strength, of military marching down the streets in cities. And let's be very blunt, mostly areas of color,
Yeah.
showing that there is a suppression of the vile people. And it's amazing to me because he didn't do this January 6th. You know what I'm saying? As a matter of fact, we
Right.
look back
Right.
on
You
it,
could
was
have called
Mike
up the
Pence.
National Guard, right?
Exactly. And now those people have been pardoned. There
Yeah.
was no one called when the Capitol literally was on fire. And now here we are. He wants an extension when Congress comes back into session for 60 days. It's diabolical in a lot of respects, but I just feel like they're doing it very clunkily, where it's obvious what the motivation is if you're looking at it from an impartial standpoint.
Yeah, I think so. It reminds me a little bit of Nixon's Southern strategy, right?
Mm,
He stoked white fear
hmm.
of criminals who are Black. And
Hmm.
that seems what this narrative is all about as well. We are going to surge resources to stop these bad criminals from harming white people. Because if you look at where they're patrolling, they're on the
Hmm.
National Mall,
Hmm.
they're at landmarks, they're not in the neighborhoods where poor neighborhoods where the crime actually occurs.
Cool.
Having worked in big cities, Detroit and Flint in my district, it's where the poverty is, where you see the most crime. And crime is committed by a relatively small percentage of the people living in these communities. And so
Hmm.
if you really want to go after violent crime, there are proven strategies for doing it: targeting gang violence, domestic violence, armed robbery crews, carjacking crews. A lot of this is organized crime. They hire kids to steal a car, but the
Hmm.
car then goes to some organized criminal organization that goes to a chop shop, sells the parts, and makes a lot of money. They use kids because they give them $100 to go steal a
Right.
car, and they're going to make 10,000 off of it. And they tell the kids they won't arrest you, they won't do anything to you because you're
Hmm.
just a kid. So
Hmm.
you can do this and you can make easy money. Why are those kids willing to do this? Because they're poor, because they're desperate. So
Bingo.
the real strategy? So let's go into those communities and let's give them the support that they need and help them, lift up their lives through education and training and job opportunities. But those communities are being ignored. Nobody's in those communities.
No.
Instead, we've got them out at the tourist landmarks so that, the white people can go along and feel good about, oh, look at Donald Trump is protecting people like me.
Right. I feel safe because these guys are here. And I think you are hitting on a reoccurring theme that is not just DC related, but it's nationwide, as you mentioned, attacking the source of the problem instead of the symptoms that are
Yeah.
visible. Right. And
Yeah.
I, to me, just from a math standpoint, this is why I'm like, there's something more to it. from a math standpoint, the preventative maintenance, the preventative things to make sure kids are not impoverished, to make sure their schools are quality, to make sure they have a full belly when they go to school, all those little things
Yeah.
translate into less crime. But to incarcerate an individual for 10, 15, 20 years, and the cost to do that it's not only significant, it's become an industry that is worth billions
Right.
in America. So that's just something to think about. And to be honest to all of our viewers, if you have not seen the amount of prisons, not just Alligator, Alcatraz, the things that are getting the headlines, but the whole industry of building prisons, vice building schools, you should really take a look into it. So that you mentioned something, Barb, shifting a little bit here, where these guys are visible in DC. You can see them everywhere. However, social media is now being flooded with National Guard people, federal agents taking down citizens. And when I say taking down citizens, it's no longer limited to the people of color. There are white dudes in their Sebagos and their khaki shorts getting taken down in the DC metropolitan area. The question that people keep asking me is, if you see that happening, what should you do? What are you legally allowed to do? How do you counter that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I guess the advice I would give is this. You're allowed to be a witness. You can even
Mhm.
record what you witness, but you cannot interfere with what the police are doing. And we have seen that this administration has been very aggressive in arresting even
Mhm.
prominent people and making an example of them. There was a judge in Wisconsin,
Mhm.
a congresswoman in New Jersey, a senator in California
Mhm.
who, said they're going to, even hint at assisting someone who was
Mhm.
threatened with arrest and got charged with obstructing or impeding a law enforcement officer. So you can't do that. If you are to see something happening, even if you think it's wrong, even if you think this person is not being arrested for proper reason, remember you don't know all the facts.
Mhm.
You may have seen what appears to be an innocent person walking down the street. They may have a warrant for his arrest, for all we know. So you
Mhm.
can't interfere. But if you think you see an example of police brutality, I mean, remember what really helped George Floyd was the video of onlookers.
Mhm.
Because although police are wearing body cameras, sometimes they get knocked off and knocked around. Sometimes they
Mhm.
don't work.
Mhm.
Sometimes they disappear.
Mhm.
But I think that if you are at an appropriate distance, if the police ask you to please back up, I think you have to comply with backing up. But if you're in a public place, you have a right to video record what you are seeing. So,
Mhm.
yeah, get out your phone and just record. I think it's good for two reasons. One is if something goes wrong, there will be evidence of it that you can
Mhm.
share with prosecutors if somebody, a police officer, overuses his use of force. But it also has a deterrent effect.
Mhm.
In fact, it's one of the things police officers like about body cameras is they say, I'm recording our conversation right now. People behave better, right? Like, oh,
Mhm.
I better,
Mhm. Mhm.
people are going to
It's
see
like a
exactly what I said
natural,
and did.
yeah, I'm saying it's a natural de-escalator in a lot of
Yes, yes.
respects.
So I think bringing out a camera is a very good thing for citizens and bystanders to do.
A real dumb question. I see this all the time. Everybody's like, "Where's the warrant? Where's the warrant?" Do these officials, whether they're federal or local, have to present a warrant when arresting someone?
No, they don't. And I think that's where
And
people
that's
get into
why I'm
trouble.
asking the
Yeah.
question. Yes.
If the agent is aware of probable cause that a
Mhm.
person has committed a crime, or if they are aware that a person has a court order to be removed from the country, they don't need to have it in their possession. And so
Mm.
sometimes people want to see the warrant. And I think that has caused some of these problems. We're like, well, without a warrant, I'm not going to let you in here. If it's a public place, law enforcement's allowed to be there. Now, they aren't allowed to come into a private place without a warrant. And I think that's
Mm.
probably where some of the confusion comes in. So into
Mm.
your home, they can't come into your home. But any business, a court, anywhere the public is allowed to go, even a hospital,
Mhm.
schools, and that's why in prior administrations. There's a saying in government that I was aware of and I used all the time, which is just because you can do something as the government doesn't mean you should. And
Mhm.
so, can the government arrest someone in a hospital or school? Yes. But should you? Absolutely not.
Right.
This administration has changed those policies against doing those things because we want to encourage people to go to hospitals and go to school and go to courts.
Mhm.
And we don't want them to be afraid that if they show up in those places, they might be arrested. And so, just to improve that public policy interest,
Mhm.
other administrations have said we're not going to, patrol there. We're not going to arrest people there. in this administration they are. So if you're anywhere the public is allowed to be, then officers have fair game to be there and to arrest someone even without a warrant.
Wow, and it's something that I think people need. I don't know if they watch TV or something where they think that is a thing. I wanted to make sure
Yep.
I specifically asked that question. And as far as going to schools and hospitals and things like that, you're right. There has been an escalation of that. What has blown my mind the most, though, is people who are legally here going to their court hearings as
Yeah.
they're scheduled to do
Yep.
and getting scooped up at court. I don't know what they can do in that situation, even though they're in a legal status. It is apparent that the current administration does not care about that. They're like, you're not a citizen. There you go. We revoke that on the spot and they get taken away. That seems to be a reoccurring theme here in the last month.
Yeah, and I want to tie that back to something you said earlier, which is it seems like the wiser course in solving society's problems is to attack the root cause. And what this
Mhm.
administration is doing instead is making a big show of attacking some of the effects. So, throwing out people who are in the country unlawfully. They can do that. They have the right to do that. But is that really the best solution? If they really
Right.
wanted to solve the immigration problem, there are a number of things we could do. We could invest in the conditions that exist in these countries that are causing people to flee their homes, right?
Mhm.
Gang violence, domestic violence, extreme weather conditions that are causing people to flee their homes. We could have rules that say if people pass through Mexico, they have to seek asylum there and not here.
Mhm.
Um, and when we arrest people, we could do what prior administrations have done, which is to prioritize immigrants who are dangerous based on threats to public safety or national security and not just going for volume. But we know
Mhm.
earlier in the year, based on reporting, that Stephen Miller, Donald Trump's advisor, was angry with
Yep.
immigration and customs enforcement agents who were doing exactly that. And they
Mhm.
said the numbers aren't what we want them to be. They said, well, we prioritize and we go after people we believe to be dangerous. And they said, stop doing that. I want you to go to Home Depot parking lots and just scoop up,
Yep.
all the day workers who show up there looking for jobs. These
Mhm.
people aren't dangerous. These are people who are working construction and getting things done in our society. Or,
Mhm.
by going to schools and hospitals and courts, they're scooping up, the grandmothers and
Mhm.
ordinary people who are here following the rules
Mhm.
and not posing a threat to anybody. Meanwhile, the harder cases, these people who are working with drug cartels and other things, are not getting arrested
Right.
because agents are too busy locking up grandma.
No, I think you raise a very valid point. And these people who are getting scooped up, many of them are doing the hardest jobs in society, jobs that regular Americans, whatever that necessarily means, are not willing to do and will have a ripple effect. The
Yep.
housing market, new construction will slow down. Agriculture is slowing down. So there are ripple effects to these decisions. Now, my final pivot point here, and I think a lot of what we've talked about is connected. We have a society where at some point, whether it's the 2024 election, right before, whatever, they thought all of this was either not going to happen or they were accepting of what this could be happening. And a lot of that was based on lies. So your book, the the attack from within, how disinformation is sabotaging American democracy and rule of law, and you've updated, by the way, for 2024, is not only timely, but it's a must read if you want to understand how are we here? Because I have friends abroad, overseas, who are like, what happened in America?
Yeah.
How did you guys allow this? And I think what you're tapping on in this book is the central theme of how we got here. Can you just explain how you pivoted from law to this? Because they're linked, but it's not the first thing I would think a lawyer of your caliber would want to go and talk about.
Yeah. So the bulk of my career as a federal prosecutor was in the area of national security.
Mhm.
When I was prosecuting national security, and a lot of the threats were about terrorism financing, ISIS, Al Qaeda, violent attacks against Americans. But I left government in 2017, and I've been teaching a course on national security at Michigan Law School. And one of the areas that has been growing in my syllabus is the area of information warfare. And it is a really powerful weapon to use against democratic societies. In America, we don't tolerate political violence, though we've certainly had more in recent years. But information warfare is something that is used in other countries, and we are seeing it here. And I think there are two reasons that it has become such an acute problem in the current age. One is technology. We have the
Mhm.
ability to use the internet, social media to send information to people by pretending where people were not. We saw a Russian influence campaign in 2016. Now we're seeing artificial intelligence creating
Mhm.
fake videos. There's all kinds of fake videos of the Pope telling us that things are, morally
Mhm.
permissible when it's not the
Mhm.
Pope at all, right?
Mhm.
Um, we've got fake videos of Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump. So, that goes both ways. But that is something that is having um, an influence on public opinion. There's this term called nudging, and nudging people to believe and think certain things based on what they consume online. That is a powerful tool. The other is deep political polarization. And to some
Mm.
extent, both parties are to blame because they have learned through data that the better bet is not to try to appeal to moderates and swing voters because they might vote for the other guy, but to
Mm.
instead double down on your base and appeal to the far left and the far right of your base in an effort to motivate them to show up at the polls. Because if they show up at the polls, they're not going to vote for that other guy. They're going to vote for you. But I think the
Mm.
cost of that sort of polarization is that each side is trying to harder than the other to be more extreme. And I think uh, I don't care about someone's politics. I don't care if you're left of Karl Marx or right of Attila the Hun, but I do think we have to acknowledge that Donald Trump and his MAGA movement have trafficked in disinformation to
Mhm.
try to gain an advantage by
Mhm.
using a number of tactics that were typically used by authoritarians. Divide and conquer, right? Dividing America into factions and trying to paint certain groups as them, whether that's immigrants or minorities or women or the LGBTQ community,
Mhm.
and trying to say that we are the good guys, whether that's the religious right or the business class, rural America, appealing to traditional values and suggesting that anyone who's not in this camp is therefore evil and hates America and wants to destroy America.
Mm.
And I think that has made it easy for him to seize power and control power. And I think in our complicated world, people just choose teams. I'm
Mhm.
either on the blue team or the red team. And, I don't love everything Donald Trump does or says, but, I
Right.
like what he's doing about crime and I like what he's doing about immigration.
Mhm.
And so he says some of these things and he's divided us into us and them. What I'd like to see is a vision by whether it's a Democrat or a Republican that comes in after this and has a vision of unity and a
Right.
vision of how we can progress together as a society and not one that is us versus them.
Man, it's like you're reading my mind on a lot of this. But I think a lot of Americans feel the same way that I do and stuff. The whole unity concept has been thrown out the window the last
Mhm.
decade, to be honest. And a part of the reason I think is because, and I'm sure you get into this and that, and how mainstream media and stuff, there are things that are just profitable. Division seems to
Yeah.
be profitable for a lot of
Yep.
people, even though it's destroying society inside out. One of the things that you mentioned, you've done some historical connections here. A lot of people are like, oh, Trump is Hitler, blah, blah, but you mentioned Mussolini. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's almost like he's 2.0 of Mussolini, because Mussolini was a media guy. People
Yep.
don't understand that, and then rolled into politics with views. If he knew how to communicate them effectively for the time period. We're looking at Donald Trump, and everybody joked and laughed when he came down that escalator. But within the first 10 minutes of him coming down that escalator, he grabbed 40% of people immediately,
Mhm.
for no other reason that he was able to stay what they had been thinking and was not canceled. And in my humble opinion, that we've been off to the races. I guess the question I have for you is there an antidote to this? I mean, because of social media, I mean, my parents' generation stuff, they're on Facebook and they circulate all of these things that you've talked about. And it's like, how do we stop this
Yeah.
from becoming a permanent thing?
Yes. So I do think that there are solutions. I think we will prevail ultimately. The only question
Mhm.
is how long it takes and how deep we go into this abyss. But I think there are things that we can do to mitigate the problems of disinformation. Some will require legislative fixes. I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, but the way social media plays around with the algorithms and the way they steal our private data and micro target us with ads to manipulate us, Those are all things with legislative solutions. I just don't know if that's going to happen now. I think
Mm,
what we can do right now are a couple things. One is educate ourselves about the tactics that disinformers use. I mean, as you said, Trump uses the same tactics that Mussolini used.
mhm,
They're updated for the current age and the current technology, but it's all the
mhm.
same stuff. And in fact, if you look at all these authoritarian leaders throughout history, they all understood how to use the communication device of their day.
Yep.
Stalin came from the newspaper industry. Hitler used radio. Mussolini used the newsreel. And
Mhm,
Trump is using Truth Social and social media to go directly to the people and say blunt things that are, divisive, but they create unity through division. We mentioned that I teach at the University of Michigan. Here, we hate Ohio State, and we're not afraid to
yep,
say it. We hate
yep,
Ohio State.
yep.
People take delight in that. And so what Trump taps into is the delight people take in demeaning others. And so when he
Mm,
posts things on social media, there are people out there who like that. They say, yeah, they cheer him on and jeer him on. Um, we need to teach people that that's a method
mhm,
of manipulation, that
mm,
not everybody is going to agree or realize it, but the more we can raise people's media literacy and look at these
mm,
tactics. Another one is declinism, to suggest that everything's going downhill. The crime in DC is out of control. We need to get tough.
mhm,
The trade deficit has us the laughing stock of the world. We need tariffs. Those are all old tactics. So when
mhm,
people read and understand that these are the same tactics that authoritarians have used throughout history, I think we're less likely to be manipulated by them.
mm.
But I
Uh,
think the most important thing is we need a vision of unity, and
mhm,
all of that can start with all of us. And so I
mhm,
think instead of dunking on our opponents, instead of sending out a post or a tweet or whatever it is that makes fun of our opponents, I think
mhm,
we need to show the same kind of grace and respect that we want to receive.
mhm,
Right? Be the change you want to see in the world. And so I think we can get there, but we need to do it through collective action, through people who care about a united America.
mm. Uh, all valid points, and that leads to my final question. Throughout all of this, there have been opinion makers, article after article written, analyzing quote mainstream media. How culpable are they for the current environment that we see ourselves in? Are
Yeah.
they Did they do enough to stop it? I mean, did they perpetuate it? What do you think from your point of view?
Yeah, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush and say the
Hmm.
media, right? Because it's a
Hmm.
huge industry with lots
Hmm.
of different players, and some are culpable and some are not.
Hmm.
But I do think that some of Donald Trump's power comes from the media.
Hmm.
They like controversy. Controversy sells. They're a business. And so when you've got someone like Trump coming on and saying all kinds of crazy stuff, people tune in. And so I think some media outlets are left in this position of, do you cover the crazy rallies or
Right.
do you not cover the crazy? Like, which is
Right.
worse, right? Are we giving
Right.
him free airtime to share his message, or is it better for people to see just how, you know, uh, uh, unusual it is what he is saying? So I think in some ways the media helped create Donald Trump. I mean, he's been
Hmm.
as you said, a fixture in the media since the 1980s. He has
Hmm.
always sought press and sought to get his name out there and put his name on everything because he's constantly seeking attention. I think I will also fault some of the media outlets that have settled what I would consider very weak defamation cases with
That's
Donald
what I was
Trump. So
leading to.
60
Yeah.
Minutes
Yep.
settled,
Yep.
ABC and George Stephanopoulos settled. And those were really winnable cases. And I think
Hmm.
when you settle cases and appease um, the president just because he threatens you with a lawsuit, I think that shows weakness, and I think
Hmm.
it sends a deterrent message and makes other media outlets who maybe have less wherewithal than CBS and ABC to wonder, oh, maybe he'll sue me, and I
Hmm.
don't have $16 million, so I guess I better pull my punches a little bit. There is an author, Victor Klemperer, who was in Nazi Germany, who wrote that critics started pulling their punches in Nazi Germany because they
Hmm.
were afraid, right? It has a
Hmm.
chilling effect on speech.
Hmm.
Gee, I don't want to be like those guys, so I better be careful what I say about the leader because I don't want him to come down hard on me. So
Hmm.
I'm disappointed in the media entities that did not fight for their right to free press.
No, I could not agree with you more. I literally, when I saw the CBS settlement, I'm like, man, Ed Bradley, Mike
Yeah.
Wallace, Harry Reasoner, they're rolling over in their graves right now, because
Yep.
there's no way that would have happened with those guys in the 80s, 60
Yeah.
minutes. I was a nerdy kid. I watched 60 Minutes every Sunday. Thank you for coming on. I want to give you the final word. Just overall, what you see, what you feel overall, and most importantly, what should we expect in the future?
Yeah, I guess one point I want to make is that I think so often we are focused on the substance of what Donald Trump says he is doing, and I think we ought to make sure we're looking to the process. So
Mm,
nobody likes violent crime. Even violent criminals will say they don't like violent crime, um, and so it's popular to go after violent crime. But there's a right way and a wrong way to do that, and
mm,
he's doing it the wrong way. I think
mhm,
there are people who will applaud that because he's, getting things done, but it's really mostly smoke and mirrors, I think. And really getting things done is hard work, and you have to roll up your sleeves and do it the right way. So I
mm,
hope people will look past the superficial and look to the processes that our country is founded on: rule of
mm,
law, due
mm,
process,
mm,
equal justice. Those are
mhm,
all really important values. And if we get rid of those things, then the president just gets to pick favorites, and he's going to go after the people he doesn't like and leave alone the people who do curry favor with him. And all of us should care when anybody is affected by political retribution. I have hope for the future, though. And I think all of us have a role to play.
mm,
Mass protests, go to your No Kings, hands
mhm,
off protests. All of that matters. It it may not matter to the leader, but it matters to the rest of us, because your friends and neighbors are going to see that there are a lot of people out there, and people who are on the fence going to realize that this moment is dangerous and it's wrong, and we need to do something about it.
mm. Huh. Barbara McQuade, we cannot thank you enough. I mean, boy, this time flew by fast. You covered a variety of topics. If you have not gone out and got her book, How Disinformation is Sabotaging American Democracy and the Rule of Law, again, long title, but that means it's chock full of good stuff. As I dig into it, I'm literally highlighting and taking notes on my little Kindle here. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to explain this to us, but most importantly, for your continued work in the subject matter that you're doing. You're influencing a lot of good young minds, and we cannot thank you enough.
Thanks very much, Bobby. Great to be with you. Thanks for the important work you're doing too. And thank you for your service to our country.
No problem. Thank you.